And the next question is, what is the difference between limiter and compressor? So there's one could assume that there's not too much of a difference, but it might have some big differences. You can do limiting with a compressor, but you cannot do the same type of compression that you do with a compressor. You cannot do it with a limiter. And I will explain that in a short minute. So let's go to FL Studio again. And this could be FL Studio, Studio One, whatever, or any. I will show you actually several plugins, several compressors, several limiters, so that you can have a better understanding of it. So let's go here to the mixer and let's load a bunch of plugins. So we have Dynamics. Let's go with this one, the Fruity limiter, because this one has both a limiter and a compressor. And you automatically see that we have different knobs already. Let's bring up one of my favorite compressors, which is we have a C4. This is one of my favorite compressors. Then we have also, I do like the Waves compressor. We have the, where is it? R compressor. I really love this plugin. I use it in every mix that I do. And then I also use one from Waves. I use this a lot, which is the Dynamics, the L1 maximizer and ultra maximizer. Let's go with the ultra maximizer because it has a little bit more controls so that we can talk about it. And then we can also use, for instance, Isotope, the Ozone 8. I also have Ozone 9 not loaded in this one, but yeah. Okay, let's go. I have a bunch of stuff here. Let's start with FL Studio. So let's remove these ones and let's talk a little bit about the difference between all of those. So if we talked about this main compressor here, we have a limiter and a compressor. So what basically a limiter is just a compressor with the knee, or not the knee, with the ratio all to the maximum. And the ratio could be 20, as in this case, 20:1, but the compressor usually would have a ratio of 50:1 and above, like 100 or even infinite:1. So everything above that, the threshold will be compressed 100%. And it will not cross that limit. That's the difference between a compressor and a limiter. And you can see that in some cases we might have attack and release for a limiter, but in some cases we do not have attack and release. So for instance, if I show you the RL1, we do have release here, but we do not have attack. So we can change, for instance, the quantization, the ether, and shaping, and the domain here. And we can change the release of the limiter. In this case, it's the ultra maximizer, but it works as a limiter. We cannot change, for instance, the attack, and we can have here the auto release, but we can control here the release time, and we can have a fast limiter or a more slow limiter. Another thing that limiters have that compressors usually do not have is a ceiling, output ceiling. And if I go here to limiter, we do have a ceiling knob in this one. And as you can see, we also have out ceiling in this one. And of course, we do have threshold. In this case, in the ultra maximizer, we do have threshold. In this case of the Fruity limiter, we do not have threshold. But what happened is basically this is doing this. So as I'm increasing the ceiling or decreasing the ceiling, I can apply gain. If I apply the gain, so let's do that. Let's bring here a loop. Let's go to packs so that I can show you a little bit easier loops. Let's bring a loop to the playlist. Okay. Let's make the time a little bit slower. Okay, so let's take the gain, and we have let me actually reduce the volume a little bit. And as you can see, we still have a little bit of range here, but if I start decreasing the ceiling, you see that what this is doing is basically just cropping all that volume for all this. The difference here is just attenuating everything. And this is the limiter. If I have, let's put this at 0. If I have a compressor, I have, if I put a ratio really, really high and I start doing this, I cannot have the same effect. So you see that everything above that above that threshold, it's going to be compressed. The same thing, it happens with the ceiling. So let's reset this. The same thing if I do this, it's kind of the same effect. So how can you distinguish between them? It's easy. So if you are in the master, I would so the difference between when to use one over the other one, it's case by case. So if you want to just compress an individual instrument, you often go for a compressor. But if you are in a master bus and you want to add some compression, or you want to increase the volume of the track, but you don't want it to go above 0 dBs or above digital clipping, then you would use some type of ceiling or some type of limiter, so that you guarantee that after above this volume nothing goes through, and this helps prevent some clipping, digital clipping, and making our track sound horrible. So one thing that we can add volume with to compress the audio is using here the gain. You see that now everything is doing the same compression that it was before, but it's not allowing the volume to go above this line here, which is the ceiling. And you cannot do that with a compressor. Okay, you can do that if you have something like this. But if I start adding the gain, you see that it's pretty much doing the same thing. So we have, because we have the threshold at 0 dB, if you look there in the hint panel, we have the threshold at 0 dB, and we have a compressor here with the gain, with a ratio of 20:1. If you start increasing the gain, it will work the similar as a limiter, but they usually serve different purposes, as you've seen. Usually with a compressor, I can just go here, go down the threshold, and start adding compression based on the threshold. In the limiter, I have output ceiling, and that's usually where I can add gain, so that I increase the volume so that it reaches that ceiling, and when it reaches that ceiling, it starts compressing. Okay, so let's see. The same thing could be said here. As you can see, if I start lowering here the volume, the output ceiling, now we start losing volume. But if, for instance, I start decreasing the threshold, it's the same thing that I was doing with the gain. But this works a little bit different. I'm like sending the threshold down so that the gain increases, and whenever it reaches the output ceiling, then we have compression. One thing that we can do is basically bring both together, and then I'm keeping the same volume. Oh, this could be more like compression. It's compression, of course, but it can work similar to a compressor, but we don't have any controls over it, like the knee or the ratio or the attack time. But yeah, so this is the difference in this one. If we go to another one, for instance, the C4, this is more like a multiband compressor. And if we attack every single compressor here as a normal compressor, we can have, in this case we cannot, because here we don't have a ratio. So here we will have a range and a gain and a threshold. So different plugins will have different parameters and different things. And the multiband compressor, usually it's a little bit different than normal compressors and limiters. But then we have, for instance, the R compressor. Again, we have a ratio that we can have a ratio, for instance, of 625 to 1. If I go down, we have a 50 to 1. So this could also work kind of like a limiter in this case. And now we have control over attack and release and some other types here, and also the threshold here. And in this case, we can also work this as an expander instead of working as a compressor with a ratio of 2 to 1. We can have a ratio below 1, and this will expand the volume instead of decreasing the volume. Then we also have the Ultra Maximizer. I talked about this one. And then, for instance, we have the maximizer here from Ozone. And in this case, we have peak, the ceiling, again, the ceiling going through, because this is a limiter or the maximizer. And then we have a threshold. We have a character that it can go fast or slow. Again, we don't have specific controls over attack and release. We might have like a knob like this that allows us to change the how fast and how slow the maximizer or the limiter is. And then we might have some other parameters, in this case, stereo independence, which I'm not sure how to explain this, and transient emphasis. So I would have to read the manual for these ones, but and we can have different types of modes or different modes. In this case, you see smooth and thick limiting and thick limiting for a rich sound, and this sharp, clear, and sharp limiting to preserve peaks. So we can have different modes also. Let's see this one, join or independent limiting of transient material in stereo channels. Okay, we would have to do some testing in these ones, but that's the main idea of, or the main difference between limiter versus compressor. I hope that answered the question.